This is lecture number 22. I think I have this going. All right, greetings in the name of the Lord. Oh, lecture 22 is called Salvation. Greetings in the name of the Lord. I bring you blessings, my friend. Blessed is this hour. Angels of God always have had the opportunity to speak and to manifest to human beings. There are many who do not deny the possibility of such manifestations by undeveloped spirits, but illogically enough, they deny that a communication with higher developed beings, whatever you may call them, should be possible. This is very short-sighted. For the laws of nature and the universe must work alike for good or for evil, or for the many stages in between. It is only a question what conditions are prepared and fulfilled. If a person denies any communication with any excarnated entity, this belief may be a wrong one, but at least there is some consequence in it. But to admit the possibility of one and exclude the possibility of the other is unreasonable. There are many ways indeed how you can test with what spirits you are communicating, and anyone who wants to judge must, under all circumstances, take the trouble to study this vast subject of how to test spirits, and only then will he be in a position to determine where they come from. I have at times spoken about this subject, and I will do so again in the future. However, for the time being, I only wish to say this. If you still lack the necessary knowledge to determine with what spirits you are communicating, what laws are involved, how you can tell, etc., you can ask your heart right now, because here you will get the answer to some extent, provided you do not let your doubts shade your feelings. So if your feelings are receptive and open, you will be able to find and feel harmony or disharmony, love, patience, wisdom, and humility, or the opposite of all of this. But your heart will only be able to speak to you thus and confirm to you what you wish to know if you are receptive, open, and put all prejudice aside for the moment. And now, my friends, I will continue the series of lectures I started some time ago. Last time I spoke, I told you that this earth is a product, a picture, so to speak, of the longing of the spirits who have fallen off, who have lived in darkness for a long time. And I have also said that this earth is equally a product of the longing of the spirits who remained in the world of God, for the fallen brothers and sisters to come back into divine light. And thus you can find here on earth beauty, love, and harmony, and you can also find the opposite, again, with all the shades in between. This is the proof that this earth sphere is a product of God's world and the longing of the fallen spirits to reunite with God, and how on this earth sphere, man has the possibility with his free will to develop and to decide what side to follow. In his own nature, there are, of course, both currents, the good current that once came from God in its own perfection, and the evil current that was accumulated, so to speak, during and after the fall. And between these two currents, the conscious self stands and has the possibility to decide to either take the line of least resistance, which is always man's lower nature, or to follow his higher self, which must be the more difficult, narrow path. I have also mentioned that communication with the world of spirit has always existed. But at the beginning, when the earth sphere was relatively new, it was impossible for man to commune with God's world because there were too many impure and unpurified currents and attitudes in the soul, too many evil desires, too much blindness to fulfill the necessary conditions. And that is why God has always sent beings on this earth who were not fallen spirits. Some of the great prophets and some of the so-called saints belonged into this category. And they did not only bring the wisdom, the love, and the purity with them to leave their mark upon this earth sphere, but due to these conditions, they had the possibility to have communications with angels of God. And this is briefly what I have said in my last lecture. So it is the essence which will prepare you for what I have to say to you tonight. So now I would like to tell you about the salvation of Jesus Christ and what it really means. There are indeed very few people who realize the full significance of this salvation, least of all the organized churches, who have mostly completely misunderstood what this salvation is. There are many people who believe that Christ died on the cross for the sins of everyone else, and that thus no one is responsible or accountable for his sins, his faults, or his weaknesses, etc. For Christ has atoned for him through his death. This, of course, my friends, cannot be. It would be utterly senseless. After the explanation of the real story of the salvation, you will not only see that this is a comfortable misunderstanding, but you will clearly perceive how this misunderstanding could have come about. I've also mentioned that the salvation was not only done on this earth sphere, but in every sphere in existence, long before this earth sphere existed and after the so-called fall of the angels, which I have gone into greater detail some time ago. God's plan was ultimately that every single one of those fallen beings should have the means to come back to him, back to the light, back to harmony. But this could only be done if God's laws were never broken, not even for the purpose of bringing back the fallen creatures. And this was indeed a very difficult task to follow through. And I also explained that each being put into creation by God was created perfectly in one way. Each being represented one divine aspect, and the purpose was that with the power these spirits were endowed with, they were themselves to extend this perfection in other realms. Let us say, for instance, one being was perfect in love, another in wisdom, and so on and so forth. Now, with this divine power we all once had, the aim was to make ourselves perfect in every other respect. The aim was to make ourselves perfect in every other respect and thus become godlike at one time. And by doing so, additional worlds of beauty would come into existence, spiritual worlds. For as you know, every thought, every feeling, every ambition, every act is form in spirit and thus creates a world. You also know that a number of spirits have used this divine power for this purpose. And a number of other spirits have used the divine power in the opposite way. And thus the fall came into existence. After this fall, Christ, who, of course, existed in the spirit world long before he was born as a man, organized, if I may use this expression, all the spirits in God's world to use all their strength and their perfection in their particular field for the help of this plan of salvation. Let me read that again because I did it weirdly. After this fall, Christ, who of course existed in the spirit world long before he was born as a man, Christ organized, if I may use this expression, all of the spirits in God's world to use all of their strength, their perfection in their particular field for the help of the plan of salvation. This is really interesting. Okay. In other words, the pure spirits, instead of continuing and extending their own growing perfection, they postpone this ultimate goal for the purpose of using their power for arranging and working for this plan of salvation. And on this and on every plane of existence. And now, of course, I'm still talking of the divine spheres. In the spheres of darkness, some time had to go by before anything could be done. Enough spirits had to have this certain longing for light before lighter worlds still in the realm of Lucifer came into existence. And without this longing, unconscious and blind as it was at the beginning, nothing could change, no matter what would have been arranged by the world of God. In your language, millions and millions and millions of years went by before, due to this longing, gradually this earth sphere came into existence. And the more souls came to live on earth because they were ready to do so, low as their development still was, the more general and individual development proceeded. For merely by living on this earth sphere, they came, for the first time since after the fall, into contact with something divine. subdued as this manifestation may have been for the most part. In the meantime, Christ was busy preparing and working in the spirit world of God, planning ahead and sending various pure spirits to live on earth, as well as organizing and teaching that should be brought to mankind through these pure spirits, now incarnated, either through inspiration and guidance or through communication with God's worlds. It's impossible for you to imagine how minutely everything had to be worked out. Minutely, I love that. How painstaking this work was so that everything was in accordance with divine laws of justice. At the time, no matter how far a human being developed spiritually, when returning to the beyond, they were still under the dominion of Lucifer. For as I have explained thoroughly the last time, every divine aspect was turned into its opposite quality. Therefore, free will, which is divine, was turned into dominion. Of course, Lucifer would not give up this dominion he held over his followers. If, for instance, a human being, due to his changing attitude, growing harmony with God, would begin to produce light and beautiful spheres in the spirit world, even these spheres were still belonging to the kingdom of Lucifer because he did not relinquish his power over this particular person. Furthermore, no one was, at that time at any rate, so far developed that he would only produce spheres of light. He would produce and own several spheres, so to speak, harmonious and disharmonious ones. And incidentally, this happens with each one of us, with each one of you, with every human being. Whatever their faults, weaknesses, blindness, according to spheres, come into existence. Wherever you are pure and purified, beautiful spheres are being created by you. And you will not only own the best, but also the worst you have built. Any relatively highly developed human being might thus have a number of light spheres. Let me do that again. Any highly developed human being might thus have a number of light spheres, but even these spheres were still under the dominion of Lucifer, as long as the salvation work in this respect was not finished. By the way, the so-called hells are constituted only by one sphere of only dire darkness and misery. But as there are many gradations in the divine spheres, the same holds true for the Luciferic ones. When enough beings who are ready and really consciously cognizant of God desire to have complete union with God, the time was right for the greatest part of the plan of salvation to take place, which Christ took upon himself. The reason was not only his infinite love and compassion for all his fallen brothers and sisters, but also the following. During the process of the fall, this first spirit who was fallen was called Lucifer and developed an intense jealousy towards Christ. Thus it was logical that Christ himself should prove his love by his great sacrifice and work, not only to all fallen creatures, but also to Lucifer himself, who through this deed alone, would one day in the far, far away future find it possible to return to God and ultimate happiness. Christ, made by God the King of the universe, as such, he was ready to have not only the highest privileges, but also the strongest responsibilities. By carrying the heaviest burden alongside his exalted position, he gave another example for the world. Thus, when the time was right, he faced Lucifer. And now, my friends, I must ask you not to think all this could not have been that way, because it all sounds so human. All you have and know as human beings, not only in subjects and objects, in abstract and concrete ideas, in language, but also in any sort of forms you know, is only a limited imitation of what existed in spirit before this material world, only in much greater variety. And often human beings think, when we mention these things, that spirits talk or have certain objects and so on, that this is too human, too concrete, and yet in spirit, as I have said repeatedly, everything is concrete. Everything is form. While in your world, only material objects have form, and the so-called abstract things do not have form, for they are invisible to you. And this is not so in spirit. Love is a form. When you have a beautiful thought, it will create one form. When you have a wicked thought, it will create another form, a concrete form for us. And therefore, I beg you to keep this in mind and not to think that this is just childish because Lucifer and Christ would not talk together like two human beings. And it may not be in exactly the same way as when two human beings talk. The procedure may be different. It is a spiritual procedure. And this, of course, is impossible to translate into human language. Therefore, the language I have to use must be limited to your understanding. So to get back, Christ would face Lucifer and would tell him, now there are so many spirits who do not wish to remain faithful to you. They desire to go back to God. Therefore, you should let them free. And Lucifer would not agree to this. He maintained he does not recognize divine law and would use his power as he saw fit. So Christ said, in this case, there must be a war between us, between your forces and the forces of the divine world. But the chances should be evenly distributed, and that means, as mentioned before, that the divine forces must be numerically in the minority for the simple reason that the forces of good are infinitely stronger than the forces of evil, and perhaps 20-1. So if you have one absolutely purified being against 20 very impure beings, the strength of this one pure being would outweigh the strength of these 20 impure ones. However, Lucifer said, even if such a war should take place, even if the divine forces should win and take my power away, I will thereby not recognize the law of God as being just. And as you know by my previous lectures, this constituted an essential part in the plan of salvation. And since no one should be eternally damned, not even Lucifer himself, and so that no eternal damnation would ever be possible, Lucifer himself would have to admit at all times the absolute justice of divine laws. Therefore, Christ asked him, in what way would you consider the divine powers to be just? And Lucifer answered, if such a war took place after there has been one being of the world of God, if you wish, living like a man without any protection at certain crucial times and without guidance by the world of God, and as a man where a great part of the knowledge is dimmed out, where matter stands in the way, yet he would remain faithful to God in spite of my own temptations and in spite of greatest hardship and misery to go through if remaining faithful to God, there must be the most difficult conditions possible. I will offer this person every possible worldly power, release of all hardships befalling him if he forsakes God. If anyone would remain faithful to God under such conditions, which I doubt very much, in fact, I say it is impossible, then I will have my battle with you, and I will recognize God's laws as being utterly just. And you must know, my friends, that each living human being has at all times guardian spirits of the world of God. With some people, they may not be able to come too close due to their own attitudes, but nevertheless, they are there. Even if they are in the background, they watch out that nothing befalls their protege, that it is always according to God's laws of justice, or that the person may be too weak to endure, to be left alone on this earth sphere without the support of God's spirit world. On top of that, having to resist all attacks and challenges, hardships and temptations that the powers of darkness could think of, seemed indeed an impossible task to fulfill. And no human being has ever had to go through anything like this, even in the remotest degree. Therefore, Christ cannot be compared with any other person who ever lived, no matter how pure or how wonderful the teachings may have been. For Christ has shown indeed, in fact, what others have taught, and this under infinitely more different circumstances than anyone else ever had to bear. So these were the conditions that Lucifer put up in order to recognize God's laws as being just. If this seemingly impossible task should really be fulfilled, then this battle could take place. If he should lose this battle, then Christ could make his terms, and he, Lucifer, would not doubt God's justice in every respect. So this was the plan, and Christ took it upon himself, although Lucifer did not specify that it had to be him. For the before mentioned reasons, my friends, if you study the scriptures from this point of view, you will get an entirely different understanding of it. I am quite sure that the reason of the life and death of Christ will thus make sense to you, because otherwise it would not make any sense that he should die on a cross for sins that others had committed. For if you have committed a sin, you yourself have to straighten it out, and no one else can or should do it for you. If someone else would do it for you, it would not mean any purification for you. So you would not have the strength you gain through the process of self-purification, which alone will protect you from committing sins again. For as long as the evil root is not torn out, it must again produce impure fruits. And the tearing out of evil roots can only be done by ourselves, by yourself. So that was not the reason Christ suffered and died. He did not have the same knowledge he had as spirit. If he would have had that same knowledge, the task would not have been so difficult. Of course, since he is the highest being in creation, he had some knowledge and a great deal of spiritual strength and wisdom. But there would be no purpose at all to a life on earth if, and this applies to everyone, the same spiritual knowledge were available as when not being in the flesh. So Christ did not know exactly what was involved while he lived on earth. In the course of the years, he received some knowledge. He had a vague idea, like any one of you might have had a vague idea. I will have this task to fulfill. But what may come of it, how it will end, what the exact meaning is, you will not know. And he did not know that either. He was not supposed to know it while being incarnated. And after a time, all the angels of God, they had to leave him. They were with him for some time of his life, but not when the really difficult task began. And I have also explained to you that the teachings he brought were important and wonderful, but this was an additional facet of his life. It was a sideline, so to speak. Whenever anything happens in strict accordance with the will of God, there is not merely one good reason and purpose, but many factors play a role. Many good purposes are fulfilled, and one divine deed. This again applies to everyone. But to bring the teachings did not constitute his reason for living as a man. Beautiful as the teachings are, they were not new. Other people before brought in the essence of the same teachings. He adjusted them according to the present times then, considering that ever-evolving development of mankind. But that was all. And as I have explained, the task was that, quite alone, cut off completely from the world of God, he had to resist temptations of Lucifer, who put the greatest effort imaginable into his goal to bring Christ to fall. He used every device possible. He organized all of his helpers. And believe me, my friends, even though he certainly lacked wisdom and insight, Lucifer is not stupid and not without great resources in his own dark powers. So on one side, Christ saw nothing but suffering, physical suffering, psychological suffering, humiliation as you cannot imagine. And this humiliation and psychological suffering was a great deal worse than the physical suffering, as bad as it was. On the other hand, he had all the temptations of the world of darkness. And of course, Christ was what you would call psychic to the maximum degree. His mediumistic qualities were more strongly developed. And not just in one department, but in every department than anyone else before or after. And this was an advantage, as long as God's world was close to him. But when he was cut off from it, this was merely an additional hardship. For all of the manifestations coming to him originated from the world of darkness. Clairvoyantly, he came in contact first with the high emissaries from the Luceric world, and then later with Lucifer in person, who showed up as a beautiful being and who offered him all the worldly advantages he might desire, an instant release from all of his sufferings, if he would accept Lucifer and give up his idea of God. Lucifer taunted him in the worst moments of his sufferings. Where is your God of love and justice? If he existed, would he allow his beloved son to go through all of this? So if your God cannot offer you more, are you not better off with me? Look what I have to offer you. Your God can only offer you intense suffering and hardship in every possible respect, and so on and so on. Can you not imagine what this meant? So if Jesus would have known the exact significance of his task, it would not have been half as difficult to resist. And this exactly should not be the case. But on the other hand, to have serious doubts at this crucial time, doubts about everything, his true identity, that there was some wise and good purpose in all of his hardships, which he would not understand at this time, and in short, about everything he had learned in the years previously, it was inevitable. Often he wondered whether he was not under some illusion, whether all of his previous knowledge was not the product of some imagination, etc. And always Lucifer would be instantly at his side on these occasions to strengthen these doubts, these thoughts. Being a man having matter between him and absolute truth, it is easily perceivable how extremely hard it was for him to remain faithful to God and to not give in. If the conditions of his task were not such that even he must have doubted at times, his task would not have been so infinitely magnificent. Therefore, Christ had to have the same obstacles of matter as every other human being, only intensified to a maximum degree. Material substance is a curtain, and man has to grope to open that curtain. Jesus Christ had to do the same, only in conditions that even with these explanations, you cannot vaguely appreciate how extremely difficult they were. To remain on the right path under these circumstances without fully understanding, my friends, you cannot really know what it means. And having the humility to put God, in spite of all these passing thoughts of doubt, above everything else, even above your suffering, above his not understanding why, was the task. And indeed, it seemed almost impossible that anyone could do it, but Jesus Christ did. With this, Jesus Christ not only fulfilled the conditions by which the world of darkness could never at any time claim that God's laws are not just, but at the same time he also set an example for us, for everyone born after him, my friends. So when you are suffering and you do not understand why, if you can think of Jesus Christ in connection with the true story of his salvation, if you can bring yourself to imagine his suffering as something real, not some imaginary legend or myth, but as real as your own sufferings, only so much worse, perhaps then it will be easier for you to follow in the footsteps of Jesus Christ, to follow in his path, and to remain in humility, and to let God take over wherever your life is concerned. So after Christ had successfully completed his task on the earth sphere, well, I could talk hours and hours about his life on earth, my friends, about his suffering, his death, but perhaps if you read the Bible now, your own imagination can give you a better idea of the deep significance and reality of all of this. Immediately following his death, a number of things took place on earth, so-called miracles, and that should show mankind that a major phase in the history of creation was over. A major new phase had begun. After the physical death of Christ, he returned into the world of spirit, having fulfilled the conditions. He, with a relatively small amount of specialized spirits in this respect, had a spiritual battle in the world of darkness. Now this again, my friends, may sound too human for you, that spirits should have wars. Where do you think wars come from? They again are only an outpicturing of spiritual wars. And although, of course, a spiritual war does not take place in exactly the same manner as a material war on earth, the spiritual essence is there. So how it happens is again impossible to describe because you are lacking the perception and understanding, and I am lacking the possibility to express myself in human language. So I can only word it in a sort of condensed way that may almost sound symbolical. And it may be symbolical to a certain extent, but nevertheless, a war has taken place between Christ and Lucifer. I had a little trouble saying Christ. But a war, nevertheless, has taken place between Christ and Lucifer. You have to use, let us say, your imagination, your inner vision, not to take it literally as though a war with guns or with spears or whatever that we have on earth, that this war has taken place in exactly that form. No, of course not. But anyway, there was a spiritual war. Again, Lucifer had to admit the justice in the ways of God's world. For as mentioned before, Christ came to fight under even conditions, and it would have been in his power not to take any risks by using greater strength and more helpers, let us say, but he did not, for the same reason that he undertook this life on earth, so as to preserve God's justice. Even in the eyes of Lucifer, the chances were even, and this was so apparent that not even Lucifer could deny it. That was so important, for the plan is, as I said, in a long, long time to come for, which you have no numbers available in years, that Lucifer himself must ultimately come to the point when he too will return to God as the very last of the fallen off creatures, as he was the first to turn away from the laws of God. So you see that Jesus Christ has fulfilled the plan of salvation in every sphere. In each sphere, the task was a different one. In various spheres of the world of God, where the manifold preparations were made, on this earth sphere, in the world of darkness, after this battle was over, new conditions were set up, which are reigning since that time after Christ's life and death on earth, and his battle with Lucifer afterwards. So in your history, you will read that after the third day, Christ went up to heaven after his descent into hell. And these various single details that were preserved are in a way a confirmation for you, although the time element is not quite exact. The time is always translated, so to speak, for in spirit time is, because for in spirit, time, if there is such a thing, is individual, psychological, and very different. But this does not matter. Mankind has made a symbol of these 3 days. These new conditions were that every human being had the possibility to turn to God during his development on earth and going from one life to the other. Lucifer had all the rights to tempt man to succumb to his own lower nature. But should man resist, he would not be subject anymore to the Luciferic world. But the doors were now open so that he could unite with his Creator and inhabit the divine worlds once more. Even the traps and temptations that Lucifer could use were from that time on limited to remain in accordance with divine law. God's spirit world now has the right to interfere so that these divine laws are observed in exactitude, so that the activities of the powers of darkness are limited and stand ultimately under the jurisdiction of God. That Lucifer still has a certain amount of freedom is necessary not only for the now so often explained reason that he must always recognize divine justice, but also as a necessary means for development. For evil has to be tasted to the brim in many cases before it can be overcome out of free will and the being's own initiative. This desire to overcome must grow through ever-mounting enlightenment in each individual's soul, and this, alas, is often only possible after going through darkness. That such enlightenment cannot come in one lifetime goes without saying. To accomplish the perfection that is needed to enter into the kingdom of God, this perfection that was lost during the fall, to shed all the darkness that has come upon a soul, this can never be done in one lifetime. So many lives or incarnations are needed, are indeed necessary. So this life on earth is like a school where from one class to the other you develop. Sometimes you may stay for a while in one class, and then you may have one or several incarnations in succession where you accomplish a great deal. The human beings incarnated from the world of darkness first come with very low and coarse instincts in them, and only after many incarnations they work off karmas. And often after some suffering and a number of divine influences, the attitude will begin to change slowly but surely. When the senses have begun to refine themselves a little bit, then the real work of self-findings and self-purification begins. And for this phase, again, many an incarnation, always under changing conditions and circumstances, is necessary. Even in the secondary phase, many beings have not yet the strength to find God in reality. There is still too much of the lower self present to succumb to the influences of the Luciferic world, whether this comes in the form of direct inspiration or through human unwitting instruments. Thus it will take again a considerable amount of lives to awaken sufficiently to strengthen one's own willpower for the all-important purpose of self-purification. And only then will come a further phase in which this process of very gradual purification begins. In each life, conditions are prepared that a certain side of the lower self has the opportunity to perfect itself best. So you see, it cannot be any other way, for it would be impossible to reach in one lifetime the necessary purification to enter the kingdom of God for good. With each life, even in the worst cases, something is gained, even if it can only be fully exploited at a later period. The period being declares, my path leads to God. I will not listen to my lower self. This lower self is constantly and magnetically in touch with the world of darkness, just as the higher self, which is much further in the background, much more difficult to attain or to reach through all these layers of imperfections. This is in constant contact with the divine world, and the outer personality with the willpower, with the capability to decide one way or the other, has the means to one day make the decisive step to declare themselves for God, for my higher self, with everything that entails. Disregarding the laziness, the comfort, the way of least resistance, to give in to one's faults. You have to disregard these. And whether these faults are still murder, stealing, wickedness, or whether these faults are now only selfishness, jealousy, envy, resentment, laziness, whatever else, makes no difference in principle. Anyone really declaring and deciding and remaining in this decision to follow this path to God, since the salvation of Christ, cannot remain a subject of the Luciferic world. And Lucifer will have no power over such a being, whether on earth or whether in the spirit world. And this is the way Christ has opened the door. And by this you may also understand why it is said that Christ has saved you from your sins. This is right only if it is understood in the way that your great sin of falling, of not remaining faithful to God, of becoming part of this world of darkness at one time. The sin of the fall has not the eternal exclusion of the divine worlds as a consequence. From this, Christ has indeed saved you, and for this you certainly have all the reason in the world to be grateful to Him, to Christ. Through Him, you now have the possibility, by your own efforts and development, to cross the threshold. In that sense, it is correct, but it is interpreted that Christ has died for all your sins and all your faults, and then it is very wrong. This is very briefly the story, or better, the history of the creation of the universe, the fall, the creation of the earth sphere, and the salvation through Jesus Christ. At the beginning of the series, I asked you, my friends, to give me all your questions you have in mind after I have finished all questions pertaining to the subject that have not been answered by the content of these lectures. I would like to suggest that you think about it, that you reread my words, which of course is so essential, for there is so much missed when you just hear it for the first time. And then for the next time, you prepare your questions, and I will then gladly answer them, as well as all the other questions that we may not now have the opportunity to deal with tonight. Is there something, however, that just occurs to you now? Question. Yes. May I ask the question whether the story in the Pistis Sophia corresponds and is a genuine story with what you said? Question. Answer. You can very well judge for yourself. There is a great deal of truth in it. Question: would it be recommended if the participants were to read the Pistis Sophia? Answer: yes, certainly. Question: and the Arcania Celestia? Answer: certainly, it would be a very good idea. May I suggest that the participants, all who are interested, gather like you have done some time ago for the lectures that you, my friend, have given, that you read it, excerpts of it, and discuss it. Afterwards, you may have discussions about the subject. This should be handled in the form of discussion groups where you can read something and afterwards discuss it. Will you be willing to do that? Answer: yes. Okay. Question: yes. Answer: I would suggest that after the session you make arrangements for time, place, and so on in an orderly way, and later on there can be books or themes. That would be extremely useful as an additional spiritual activity, and it will contribute a great deal to everyone's understanding. And let me tell you, my friends, the understanding of these matters is much more relevant and personal than you may first think. Anyone who knows my lectures will have observed that I very rarely speak about these things. Generally, I speak about the human soul, about the spiritual laws as they apply to the human soul and the individual human life. And I will return to this type of lecture from next time on, with only occasional deviations, when I will again deal with such apparent general questions. All those general questions should extend your comprehension about the individual soul. All I have discussed here that my good friend will bring to you from a different angle is very relevant for each and every individual's belief, not only merely by the fact that to understand these essential things will shed a great deal of light on points hidden thus far. By light, you will be enabled to have a purer, more harmonious relationship with God. It will eliminate doubts about the justice of God and how all this evil is possible. Why does he permit this evil, and so forth? And if these questions are cleared up, you can turn with a freer heart to your Creator and thus find the strength that you so badly need for your personal development. But not only for this purpose is it important for you to have some understanding about these questions, basic as it may be. You see, in every individual soul, this story I have told you in these 4 major stages is going on all the time, every day, almost every hour. And if you can, through meditation, find out the personal, not only similarity, but actual repetition of all this in your own soul, you will have gained a great step forward. And I'm going to stop there. And that is it.